What would you do if you were accused of a crime you didn't commit, just because of who you are? What would you do if you were accused of a crime you didn't commit, just because of who you are? Maya Carter stood in the middle of the courtroom, her back straight, but her hands trembling slightly. The air felt thick with tension, a weight that seemed to press down on her chest with every passing second. She tried to focus, tried to block out the judgmental stares of the jury and the whispers that swirled around her, but it was impossible. It felt like the whole room was watching her every move, every breath she took. The prosecutor stood with a smirk on his face, confident that his case was airtight. He barely glanced in her direction as he spoke, focusing more on his notes than on Maya herself. His words were sharp, calculated, designed to make her seem like just another statistic. A black woman from a poor neighborhood, automatically guilty of whatever crime had been pinned on her. The jury avoided her gaze. They looked down at their notes, shifted in their seats, or stared ahead, doing everything they could to avoid acknowledging the woman standing in front of them. Maya couldn't blame them. In their eyes, she was just another face in the crowd, another defendant in a long line of people who had been accused but never truly seen. The judge barely looked up from his papers, his eyes flicking over the documents with a disinterest that was almost palpable. Maya knew the drill. She had seen it all before. The justice system didn't care about her past, her story, or the truth. All that mattered was the surface-level narrative that had been constructed about her. She wasn't a person to them. She was just another case, just another number on a long list of people who had been falsely accused because of who they were. Guilty before she even spoke. Maya clenched her fists, the anger boiling beneath the surface. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had never stolen, never hurt anyone, and had worked her whole life to stay out of trouble. Yet here she was, in front of a courtroom, being accused of something she didn't do. Her chest tightened with frustration and fear. What if no one believed her? What if the truth was lost in a sea of prejudice and assumptions? No one knew who she really was. No one knew the truth. Her life had been turned upside down by a lie, and the weight of it felt suffocating. She had spent so many years proving herself in a world that never gave her a chance. She had worked harder than anyone, stayed focused, stayed quiet, just trying to make something of herself. But it didn't matter. The world had already decided what kind of person she was, and when they did, the entire courtroom would never forget this day. Maya swallowed hard, the words of her lawyer echoing in her mind. Tell the truth, no matter what. But it was hard, so hard to stand up for herself when the system had already stacked the odds against her. She was tired of fighting, tired of proving herself over and over again. But she couldn't back down. She couldn't let them think she was guilty, not when she knew the truth. Her lawyer gave her an encouraging nod, urging her to speak. And in that moment, Maya knew it was her turn. She had a choice to make, whether to stay silent and let them decide her fate, or whether to speak up and fight for her innocence. The room fell silent as Maya took a deep breath and stepped forward. The weight of the world seemed to hang on her shoulders, but she didn't let it stop her. She would make them listen. She had to. Do you think Maya will be able to prove her innocence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. They called her a liar, a fraud, a thief. But they didn't know what they were up against. Maya stood there, her heart pounding, as the accusations came at her like a barrage of bullets. She had been accused of stealing $500,000 from a high-profile business, a crime she knew she didn't commit. But the system didn't care about the truth. It cared about who was easiest to blame. And right now, she was the easiest target. There was no real proof, no solid evidence linking her to the crime, just suspicion. And in their eyes, that was enough. The whispers around the room, the sneers, the judgment, it all made her feel like the walls were closing in. It didn't matter that she had worked hard her whole life to build a reputation, to prove she was worthy. It didn't matter that she had nothing to do with the crime. All that mattered was the way they saw her. To them, she was just another woman trying to get ahead by deceit, trying to take what wasn't hers. The prosecutor, a smug man in a tailored suit, stood in front of the jury. His demeanor oozed confidence, his every word calculated to sway the room in his favor. He knew the power he held. He knew that the jury was already leaning toward his side, ready to label Maya as guilty, even before the trial had really begun. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rich with disdain, "this woman thinks she can fool us. But we know what people like her do. She's nothing but a con artist." Maya's breath caught in her throat. He made her sound like a criminal, a liar, a fraud. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong in their eyes. They didn't care about the details, about the evidence that didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. They cared about the fact that she was a woman of color, working in a high-powered job, and that made her suspicious in their eyes. That made her the perfect scapegoat. The jury nodded along, their faces unreadable but their body language telling a story of its own. They weren't listening to her. They weren't even considering the possibility that she could be innocent. They were just waiting for the verdict, waiting for the moment when they could declare her guilty and go home. The judge remained unmoved. His eyes were focused on the prosecutor, his gavel resting quietly on his desk. He hadn't said a word, but his silence spoke volumes. Maya had seen this before. A system that didn't listen. A system that wasn't interested in the truth, only in what was easiest. And right now, it was easier to label her as guilty than to dig deeper and find out what really happened. Maya clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had spent her whole life fighting to prove herself, fighting against the assumptions people made about her, against the stereotypes that followed her wherever she went. She had worked harder than anyone to get where she was. And yet, here she was, treated like nothing, like a criminal. It hurt. But Maya wasn't going to let them break her. She had come too far. She had seen too much injustice in her life to back down now. They could call her whatever they wanted. They could accuse her of whatever they liked, but they would not take her dignity. She let them talk. Let them accuse her. Let them spin their lies. But soon it would be her turn. Soon she would stand up and make them listen. She would show them the truth, and no matter what they thought of her, they would have to hear it. The room was still, the air thick with tension. But Maya's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't just going to let them take her life away. She wasn't just going to be the person they said she was. She was more than that, and she was going to prove it. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to lose. Do you think Maya will get the justice she deserves? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. How do you prove your innocence when no one is willing to listen? The prosecutor continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. He stood tall, confident, knowing that the jury had already made up their minds. To him, this was just another case of a guilty woman trying to weasel her way out of it. And he was determined to make sure she didn't get away with it. "Miss Carter," he said, turning toward her, Do you have anything to say in your defense? The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. What could she say? What could she do when it felt like everyone in the room was already convinced of her guilt? She had spent her entire life fighting to be heard, but it seemed that no matter how hard she tried, the world refused to listen. And now, here she was, standing in front of a judge, a jury, and a prosecutor who had already written her off. But she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Maya stood slowly, her knees feeling weak beneath her, but her resolve unwavering. She could feel every eye on her, waiting for her to stumble. She had seen it before. The way people waited for her to fail. The way they assumed she couldn't possibly be capable of defending herself, of standing up for the truth. But they didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with anxiety, but also with something else. Something that had been building inside of her since the moment she was accused. Anger, frustration, and the fierce determination to make them see her for who she really was. She had been quiet long enough. It was time to end this game. Maya's hand went into her pocket. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of a small envelope, one that she had kept hidden for days. The evidence she had gathered. The one piece of truth that they couldn't ignore. She pulled out the envelope, and the entire courtroom seemed to stop. The murmur of whispers died down. The prosecutor faltered, his smug expression faltering for the briefest moment. Even the judge, who had been mostly indifferent up until now, leaned forward in his seat. Maya held the envelope up, making sure everyone could see it. Her heart raced, but her voice was steady as she addressed the room. "I've been quiet because you didn't want to listen," she began, her words cutting through the silence. "You've already decided who I am. You've already decided what I did. But I didn't come here to beg for your mercy. I came here to show you the truth. And this," she gestured to the envelope, "is the truth." They thought they had her figured out. They were so wrong. Maya stood tall, her voice calm but unwavering as she reached into her bag. She pulled out a small leather badge, the unmistakable emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She held it up for everyone in the room to see. Her eyes locked on the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury. "My name is Special Agent Maya Carter. I work for the FB." The courtroom fell silent, the atmosphere instantly shifting. The judge's gavel slipped in his grip, his hand fumbling as if he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. The prosecutor's smirk, the one that had been so smug just moments ago, vanished in an instant. His face turned a pale shade of disbelief. The jury gasped, their eyes darting between Maya and the judge, their expressions filled with confusion and surprise. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Maya could feel the weight of the room's scrutiny, but she didn't flinch. This was her moment. She had been underestimated, treated like a criminal when she was the one telling the truth. Now, it was time for them to see the real story. This entire trial was based on lies, and I have proof. Her words rang out, cutting through the stillness of the room. She turned to the judge, her movements deliberate, controlled. With a swift motion, she slammed a thick file onto the desk in front of him. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed throughout the courtroom, and the room tensed in anticipation. Inside that file was everything. The truth that had been buried, the lies that had been spread. She watched as the judge's hands trembled, his eyes scanning the pages in front of him, as if he were slowly coming to terms with what he was reading. Maya didn't speak again, letting the evidence do the talking for her. The prosecutor stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, unable to comprehend the turn of events. He had spent the entire trial painting Maya as the guilty party, and now she was turning the tables. This wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about exposing the corruption and deceit that had fueled the entire case. Maya's gaze flicked to the jury, her voice steady as she addressed them. The man who accused me, the very one who claimed I stole his company's money, is the real criminal. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. She could see the disbelief on their faces, the shock as they began to process the reality of what was happening. Maya continued, her confidence growing with every word. I've gathered emails, wire transfers, and witness statements, all pointing to one thing: a cover-up orchestrated by the very businessman who accused me. She turned to the judge. He manipulated the system to get rid of me, to silence me, because I was getting too close to the truth. The room erupted in whispers, the tension palpable. The judge slowly looked up, his face a mix of disbelief and dawning realization. The prosecutor opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. His defense, his case, crumbled before his eyes. Maya didn't need to say anything more. The evidence was undeniable. The businessman who had once stood on the other side of the courtroom accusing her was now exposed for the fraud he was. The emails, the wire transfers, each piece of evidence laid bare the depth of his deception. And the most damning part, the very people who had tried to destroy her were now facing the consequences of their actions. The people who had tried to bury her, to cast her aside, to ruin her life. They were about to lose everything. As the room buzzed with chaos, the judge slammed his gavel down in an attempt to regain control, but his voice shook. This trial will be suspended. An investigation will begin into the allegations against Mr. Calloway. Maya stood, calm but unshaken, watching as the room swirled in disbelief. She had done it. She had exposed the truth, and nothing could take that away from her. Do you think the corrupt businessman will face justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. When the truth finally comes out, it's not always pretty. The judge leaned forward, his face pale, his eyes scanning the documents Maya had submitted. His hands shook as he read through the files. Emails, wire transfers, witness statements, each piece unraveling the web of lies that had been spun around her. For the first time, he understood the full scope of what had happened, the depth of the corruption he had inadvertently allowed to thrive in his courtroom. The prosecutor, once so confident in his position, now looked like he wanted to disappear. His once perfect composure was gone, replaced by a look of panic, his eyes darting around as if searching for some way to salvage what had just fallen apart. He couldn't. The truth had already been laid bare, and there was no way to deny it. The courtroom was still, the silence broken only by the faint rustling of papers and the muffled sounds of people shifting in their seats. Maya stood, her eyes fixed on the judge, her expression calm but steely. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. There was no victory dance for her. For days, she had been humiliated, ridiculed, and treated like she was nothing. People had assumed she was guilty without a second thought. They had mocked her, dismissed her, and placed her at the center of a crime she didn't commit. But now, suddenly, they respected her. Now, suddenly, they were listening. It felt hollow. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was tentative, almost apologetic. Miss Carter, Agent Carter, I had no idea. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't let her anger show. She had no interest in his apology. She'd been through too much to care about what he thought now. He had made his decision. He had believed the lies. Now that the truth had been revealed, he wanted to backpedal. She wasn't here for that. "You didn't ask who I was," Maya said coldly, her voice steady but filled with weight. "You assumed." Her words hung in the air as the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury absorbed the gravity of the situation. They had all assumed. They had assumed that a woman like Maya, black, ambitious, and unapologetically strong, couldn't possibly be innocent. They had assumed that someone who didn't fit their narrow view of the world must be guilty. It was easier to believe the lie than to face the uncomfortable truth. And now, their entire case was crumbling around them. Their carefully constructed narrative was shattered, reduced to nothing more than a house of cards, each piece of evidence crumbling under the weight of reality. Maya stood taller now, her hands steady at her sides, but inside her heart still raced with a mixture of relief and rage. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth. It was about what had been done to her, and how people who thought they were untouchable had been allowed to get away with it for so long. The prosecutor finally spoke, his voice quieter now, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "We will be launching an immediate investigation into Mr. Calloway's actions," he muttered, but it sounded more like an afterthought than a statement of intent. They learned her name today, but they would never forget it. The courtroom had fallen silent as the final words were spoken, and the charges against Maya were immediately dismissed. There was no hesitation, no further questioning. The judge, his face pale with the realization of his own failures, barely even glanced at her as he made his decision. Maya had already won. The real criminal, the man who had framed her, was arrested on the spot. His smug expression melted away as the officers took him into custody. The evidence was irrefutable, and there was no escape for him now. The truth had shattered his carefully constructed lies, and there was nothing left for him to cling to. His power, his connections, meant nothing now. He was just another man, caught and exposed, nothing more. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial accusing Maya, stood frozen. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He had done everything in his power to convict her, but all of his efforts had been undone by the very truth he had tried to bury. The judge, who had allowed the case to proceed without proper scrutiny, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could no longer hide behind the guise of impartiality. The jury, they sat still, unable to hide their shock and disbelief. Maya had proven them all wrong, and they knew it. But Maya didn't look at them. She didn't care to. The battle had been fought and won. It wasn't just about this courtroom or this case. It was about what they had tried to take from her, what they had tried to take from every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, underestimated, or silenced. Maya stood up, her posture straight, her head held high. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her as she walked out of that courtroom, eyes that had once seen her as nothing more than a suspect, a scapegoat, a woman who didn't belong. Now, she walked out as the one who had forced the truth into the light. She had been underestimated, but in the end, it was her strength and her unwavering belief in justice that had prevailed. "Next time," Maya said, turning back one last time before stepping out of the door, "choose your scapegoat more carefully." The words rang out in the courtroom, clear and final. She didn't need to say anything else. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. She had done what they thought was impossible. She had turned their world upside down with nothing but her courage and the truth. Maya wasn't just a black woman fighting for justice. She wasn't just a victim of a broken system. She was justice itself. As she walked out of the courthouse, her steps confident, her heart steady, Maya knew that this victory was just the beginning. The world had tried to silence her, but now they had seen what happened when you pushed someone like her too far. She wasn't going to stop here. There were more battles to be fought, more truths to be uncovered. But now, Maya Carter was untouchable. She had taken back her power, and nothing could take that away from her. Do you think Maya's story will inspire others to fight for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments.